All right, so let's go ahead and get started. As I talk, feel free to drop questions into the chat. I will keep an eye on it as I go and make sure that I answer your questions. I might not answer them in the moment because I know that we're either going to get to that topic as we keep on going, or because I want to make sure that we get through all of our planned material before running out of time tonight. But I promise that I will stick around and answer any questions that you all still have by the time we get to the end. Um, and for those of you who do not know me, I'm Kat Lawson. I'm the Director of Voter Protection for the North Carolina Democratic Party. Very excited to get the chance to be doing indoor poll observing this fall. This is a big change, but fortunately, a lot of folks here have gone through this before, and you all understand that things are just a little extra chaotic in North Carolina elections right now. So a couple of our kind of ground rules and norms. So like I said, put questions and comments into the chat. I'll check in on them kind of during breaks in the contents. One of the tricky things talking about anything involving elections is the reality that we have 100 county boards of elections that all train their poll workers, sometimes just a little bit differently from each other. So you all who are veterans, there might be some kind of unique distinctions to what your county does. Sometimes what they do is completely fine. Sometimes what they do is actually against the law, and we're going to keep working to correct it. But just be mindful as we share, as you all swap stories and share things in the comments, that there might be some level of variation. What I'm going to talk about and my standards for what we're discussing and what's in the deck here is going to be based on what the actual law and formal rules are, and then kind of the rule of averages for everything else that we know. But we'll adapt as we go. This deck and a bunch of other materials will be shared with you all afterwards. So the slides are denser than normal. This is a lot. This is a content heavy training. So I do know that that's a lot to try to keep track of in the 60 minutes that we're together, but the deck will be shared with you. There will be a recording that you all will have access to, in addition to other resources that I will talk about as we go. And so by the end of tonight, you all will understand the role of being a poll observer. You'll know how to identify and solve problems, and you'll understand how to document issues, report back, and all the different resources that you all will get. So hopefully all of those big questions will be answered by the end of the evening. And so with that, let's start off with just poll observer basics. So I see we do have a lot of experienced folks here tonight, but for those of you who might be new or who might be watching the recording of this later and might be new, so a poll observer, right, are y'all. You are observers and volunteers who go and sit inside voting locations in order to watch the voting process. So really, poll observers are the first kind of line of defense that we have when it comes to making sure that elections in North Carolina remain free and fair. This is especially important this cycle. So after December of last year, a bill was passed that changed who gets to appoint the tie-breaking vote on our state board of elections and for our county boards of elections. And so what that means is that instead of where we had before 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans on all of our county boards and on our state board, we now have 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. That has already had consequences in how elections are going to be administrated at the local level. We'll talk about the team of precinct officials that are in charge of monitoring voting at individual sites. But essentially, we now have a lot of people who are first timers when it comes to being in charge of elections. And not all of them are coming in with experience, and not all of them are coming in with good faith. And so the work of being present in these locations is one of the best ways that we're going to have to, one, make sure that voters who vote this cycle, this fall, get their votes counted, and also to make sure that we're starting to catch bad habits or bad instructions or variations that are unacceptable now instead of waiting until we see them in 2026. So there are 3 different ways that you can become an indoor poll observer. For most people, you all are going to be location-specific observers. So you will get assigned to one particular precinct location for a particular shift, either during early voting or on election day, and your name gets submitted to the County Board of Elections with that shift location, and that's where you have to go. Every single county also gets to have 10 roving people. So for counties where they have a smaller municipal election and they don't have a ton of voting sites, this might be all of their indoor observers. But some counties will instead have kind of super experienced volunteers, or just really flexible volunteers, folks who have a lot of extra kind of time and capacity, who will be able to roam around their county and go to any location in the county to be an indoor poll observer. And then similarly, there are statewide observers. So the state Democratic Party, we get to appoint 100 roving observers around the state, folks who can go into any location in any county. And again, obviously that maximizes for people who have a lot of flexibility on their hands. But these are the basic categories of indoor observers. The Republican Party also gets all of these different options. So we'll talk about who you might be seeing alongside you as you volunteer. So for where you all are going to be, right? We're going to be at voting sites. And so this is the progression of space, and you all have more access than any other type of volunteer when it comes to voting sites. So a voting site or the polling site, right? That's going to be the building and the surrounding area where voting and campaigning happens. As you get closer to the building, you have your electioneering zone, right? So this is usually, right, this is going to be all the tables with the candidates and the parties and the flyers and the signs that kind of line the path into the building. And then as you get closer and closer, you're going to cross what's called the buffer zone. So every single polling site, every single voting location has a line about either between 25 and 50 feet from the entrance that is a non-electioneering zone. Essentially, it's the quiet zone. Once voters cross into that line, nobody's allowed to try to campaign to them anymore. You can't talk to them, you can't hand them stuff, you can't interact with them. The voters have to be left alone. And then you get into the actual voting enclosure, the place where the ballots are, where the tabulators are, where the voting booths are, right? The inner sanctum of the voting experience. And that is where indoor observers get to be. We have other types of volunteers who stay on the outside of the building, but they're not allowed to come inside. So you all go through this special training and you go through this specific credentialing process so that you can be the ones who sit inside and watch and observe and report out. So indoor poll observers from that, inner sanctum, from the voting enclosure itself, you all are charged with observing the poll workers and observing their interactions with voters. You have the capacity and you have the authorization to talk to the chief judge in a voting location if you see something wrong, and to try to advocate for better practices in how poll workers are interacting with voters. You also get to kind of touch base and check in with folks who are outside, whether those are outdoor poll observers, whether those are greeters with the Democratic Party, whether you happen to know, right, other kind of mutually aligned folks who are campaigning or talking to people on the outside of the building. And then you also get to report through our specialized reporting methods on any issues you're seeing, especially issues that are either emergencies, which we'll categorize, or that are the types of things that need to be reported immediately because they're really bad and dangerous, or because you just have a precinct judge who is just not playing ball, right, and is not being receptive to the issues that you're raising. And so to support all of this work, right, because that's a lot of things that you're going to be trying to stay on top of and pay attention to, these are the different resources you're going to have. So first of all, we are going to have a full boiler room. So a boiler room is it's a bunch of election attorneys and attorneys who are trained in election issues who are going to be on standby to answer questions and to do follow-up on any issues that you all find out and observe in the site. So they're also going to be on standby to answer any questions you have. If you see something and you're like, look, I can't remember from my training if this is or isn't a problem, or what is supposed to happen instead, and I can't find it in the documents that I have, so let me call in and see what the lawyers have to say. But you're also going to have a poll observer quick guide. So this is going to be a shorter document with a bunch of essentially FAQs and the top line issues that we're going to discuss tonight that you can reference, whether that's on an iPad or a tablet, or whether you want to print it out, you'll have access to that. You'll have LBJ, which we'll talk about, which is the tool that we use to report on problems. You'll have a fuller manual in addition to the quick guide that kind of goes into more detail and depth with actual citations to the law about different issues that you can refer to. And then you'll also have a whole bunch of different kind of topic specific resources that are published by the state board, so that you're not only referring to partisan materials, especially if you have to share them with a precinct judge. So these are all the different kind of resources that you will have And you'll be sent these numbers. These numbers, if you've been a poll observer before, are the same they've always been. Reaching out to the lawyers in the boiler room is going to be that top line number. This is only for our volunteers, so we don't share that number out. The voter assistance hotline is 833 vote for NC. It is staffed. It's not open like 12 hours per day, but we do respond to voicemails that are left within 48 hours. So that's what you can share out with voters. But you all get the special boiler room phone number. So let's talk about what you can expect at the polling site. So this is essentially the cast of characters that you're going to be dealing with at the polling location. So first, and kind of most importantly for you all to know, there's a chief judge. The chief judge is not necessarily a lawyer. They are not a real actual judge, but they are in charge of this particular location. So the chief judge is the head poll worker. They're the ones who will correct poll workers if they're doing something wrong. They're the ones who you will talk to if you think that something needs to be fixed or changed. They are the ones who are essentially in charge of making the in-the-moment decisions about how to handle any complications that come up. So these are the people who are most responsible for what goes on at that location. In addition to the chief judge, there will be 2 precinct judges, and those 3 people together will sometimes, when there's a conflict, have to take a vote and make a decision about how something is going to get handled. So it used to be, right, that we could reliably count on there being 2 Democrats and 1 Republican as part of this team of 3. That is no longer true. Almost all of these chief judges are now Republicans, and most of these 3-person teams are going to be 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. In some counties, it's two Republicans and 1 unaffiliated voter. And so we have a real shift in kind of how we are strategically approaching conversations with these folks, because we can no longer assume that they are kind of democratically aligned and that they share our democratic values when it comes to elections. So we'll talk about how that changes our kind of approach with them later on. In addition to those folks, right, and then like all the different poll workers on the site, right, you have observers. After the change in the law last time, there can be up to 3 observers per party in each location, right? That can get very crowded very quickly. I don't think we're going to have enough volunteers yet in order to do that on our end, right? We yearn for the day where everybody is so jazzed about being an observer that they come in and do this. But there are very likely will be observers appointed by the Republican Party there as well. And then, of course, you're going to have the voters themselves coming in and going through the entire voting experience. So these are the people who staff, manage, and come through the voting place. You all, as people who get to be inside, right, the voting enclosure itself, you get to pay attention to some really important things. If you're there as part of the opening shift for poll observers, you will get to watch the poll observers set up the site, or excuse me, the poll workers set up the site. And you'll get to watch them go through their opening procedures, powering on the tabulator machines, making sure that if there are ballot marking devices, that those get to be, that those are turned on and working properly, making sure that the tabulator count starts the morning at 0, all of those kinds of things you get to observe and check and confirm are correct. And for that, you'll have a nice little checklist in the manual that you get that you can kind of go through so that you're not trying to remember all of this stuff in the moment. You will also, right, get to move around the space. You cannot be disruptive when you move around the voting enclosure, but the law is very clear. You do get to move around. So here are the different kind of areas or zones within each voting location. So you have the voter check-in table. So this is when, right, voters first arrive and they check in. During early voting, this is also where they're potentially going to do same-day registration. You then have, after they've checked in successfully, voters would get sent to the ballot station where the poll workers pull the correct ballot for the voter. If anything goes wrong at that point, right, at either of those 2 points, voters might get redirected to the help desk or the help station, right? So this is where if there's a problem with their voter registration, if there's a problem with their photo ID, if they need help, or if there's some kind of problem, right, this is where voters get sent. And then you have, right, the ballot booths themselves where the voting happens. And then you have the place where all the ballot tabulators are and where people actually get to vote. For your purposes, you are going to find a place to sit near or stand near, or you'll toggle back and forth really between voter check-in and the help station. These are the places where there is the most direct interaction between the poll workers and the voters themselves. When things go wrong, right? These tend to be the places where it happens. The exception to that is if things go wrong at the ballot tabulators, and it's pretty easy to tell when something is going wrong because you'll start seeing poll workers cluster around the machines and start opening drawers and trying to like finagle with it. So if you see that happening, you'll go stand by the ballot tabulators. But you will never go near the ballot booths themselves. You will never hover over the tabulators, certainly never so much that you can actually see the ballots that the voters are submitting. Really, you're going to be spending all your time at the voter check-in tables and at the help station. So that's where you're going to be spending the bulk of your time and where the things that we're going to be talking about really do occur. And if you're there at the close of the day, right, you will get to observe the closing procedures. So, for example, you'll get to make sure that the poll workers are allowing people who are already in line at the close of voting to still vote, right? You don't have to have finished voting at 7:30. You need to be waiting in line to vote at 7:30, right, on election day. And so making sure that the poll workers are tracking, right, where is the end of that line at 7:30 and that they are letting those people and not turning them away anymore. You'll be able to make sure to watch during early voting that when the tabulators are turned off, that they don't count the ballots, but they count how many ballots have been submitted. So it'll present a vote count, which is essentially here's how many, the number of ballots that have been fed into this machine. They just won't have actually counted who everybody voted for yet. So you'll be able to check that number. And then on election day, when all the voters are finished, the tabulators will create a paper tally of the votes that are cast at that location. It's called a results tape. You're allowed to see that and take that if you want. So these are the different procedures for the closing the same way that there will be a checklist of things to look for, do, and report on in the morning for people who do a morning shift. There will also be a checklist for the end of the day closing procedures and how to report on them and what to report on them at the end. All right, so before we start talking about the substance of which I'll be looking for, I'm going to answer some of these questions. So Wayne, yes, it is helpful to keep track of the numbers at closing, especially during early voting. So that'll be one of the prompts in the checklist at the end of the day. So we'll be making sure that you all know to go check on that. So Kathy, for your 10 roving volunteers, I'll email you separately with all of our county leads and our county chairs about how you all will identify your volunteers for that particular role. So Pamela, the reason that we now have 3 Republicans on or why we have 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat on average for our precinct judges, our precinct officials, is because we now have 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats on our county boards of elections. And that change happened because of SB 382 in December of last year, when the General Assembly removed the state board balance vote from the governor's office and gave it to the auditor's office. And so instead of the governor being able to appoint the chairs of our state board and of our county boards, which has been the rule for over 100 years, now for the first time, the Republican auditor gets to appoint the chair. So that is what caused this shift in all of our numbers and why we have a lot more questions, frankly, about how any of this is going to work and who's experienced and who knows what's going on and all of that. All right, some of these other questions are going to get addressed as we keep going. All right, so let's now talk about what you all are going to be looking for. So the shortcut for knowing what to pay attention to are these things. Anything that causes a delay, when you start noticing that voters are not moving through the process for some reason, right? That's a good thing to figure out what's going on and why. If you see voters being sent to the help desk, you're going to pay attention to that. You're going to pay attention to voters who are turned away and who leave without voting, right? It's really important for us to try to identify why that might be happening. And then anytime you see poll workers like clustering inside the voting spaces, also a good indication that something might be going wrong, right? We don't care if they're clustering in like the break room, they're allowed to do that. But if they're starting to gather right around one particular computer or one particular tabulator, or like 3 of them are at the help desk, something might be going wrong, right? And you might want to get into position so that you can listen in and hear what that is. With that catch-all though, here are some of the big things that we're paying attention to. The first one is voter ID. So the good news is last year there were fewer problems with voter ID than we were afraid there were going to be. However, we now have a whole bunch of new people in charge of administering the voter ID requirements in North Carolina, so we don't know if that's going to remain true. So the short lesson, right, is that voters are still going to be asked to show photo ID at the polls. And also, voters who don't have an acceptable photo ID are still allowed to vote. And so, what we look for when poll workers are asking voters for their photo ID, we're looking to make sure that the poll workers are not being discriminatory in how they review those IDs. So, the legal standard for reviewing a photo ID is that the photo ID has to reasonably resemble the voter presenting it. The guidance from the state board that still exists says that changes in appearance caused by aging, caused by facial modifications, caused by changes to gender presentation, none of those are reasons to reject a person's photo ID so long as they still reasonably resemble the photo. The election worker is also not supposed to be using the photo ID to check the address. The only reason they would use the photo ID to check the address of the voter is if the voter is doing same-day registration and using, for example, their driver's license or their passport, both as their photo ID and as their proof of residency. So if they're not same-day registering, the election worker should not be asking questions about their address. We still have a huge list of approved photo IDs. And again, this list and all of its stuff, all of this information will be in the materials that are shared with you all later. But we still have, right, a pretty expansive list for what photo IDs are accepted. So there are two kind of categories of photo IDs. Photo IDs that have to be either current or only have expired within the last year include driver's license, a state ID, right? The free voter IDs from county boards of elections, passports, college and university IDs that have been approved. And then there's also a list of approved kind of municipal government and local government or state employee IDs that can also be used for voting. So we have a full list of what those all are. You all will have access to that. And then all of those for people who are under the age of 65, that those IDs have to be current or only have been expired within the last year. For voters who want to use one of these IDs, but they are 65 or older, they are allowed to use an expired version so long as it was still good when they were 65. So people might be doing math with voters at the polls. So if you see that there seems to be a poll worker, especially if they're dealing with somebody who you might assume or might guess is older than 65, right? You might be paying attention to, like, are they actually carefully doing the math if that voter seems to be presenting an expired ID? Now, any voter at any age is allowed to use a military or veterans ID or a tribal enrollment card, and it doesn't matter if those have expired. So those are allowed to still be used even if they expired a long time ago. And then the last final category, right, doesn't happen often, but it might come up and you might see this happen. An out-of-state driver's license or state ID is allowed to be used if the voter moved to North Carolina within the last 90 days. So they need to have lived in North Carolina for 30 days before the election in order to be legally eligible to vote here, but they don't need to have changed their driver's license yet. That can be not up to 90 days old before they do that. With all of those different options though, right, the main thing we're always going to be looking for and we're really paying attention to is the use of an ID exception form. So voters who don't have one of those IDs is still allowed to vote with an ID exception form. So the ID exception form describes 3 different reasons for why a voter cannot present their photo ID when they have shown up to vote, because they either have a reasonable impediment, a religious objection to being photographed, or they have experienced a recognized natural disaster. So for last year, everybody who was in a county impacted by Helene was able to claim that natural disaster exception for not having access to their photo ID. the most common one that folks use is the reasonable impediment standard. And so the utility of using this form is that the law says that if a voter submits this ID exception form with their ballot, that ballot must be counted by the county board after it has gone through the administrative check process. And so we always want to make sure that those forms are being offered to voters who do not have their ID and can otherwise qualify here. And so the reasonable impediment, right, includes not just I can't get one, but it's I have too many legitimate obstacles to getting one. So folks who can't get an up-to-date or approved ID because of a lack of transportation, because they have a disability or illness, right? They don't have some of the underlying documentation needed to get it. Family responsibilities, right? We have a lot of folks who are caretakers, right? Either of children or of parents or of other folks. And if that prevents them from being able to get an ID, they're able to say that and say, this is why I cannot have one. And so when they say that, they are allowed to fill out this form, cast a ballot, and have that ballot get counted later. So the things we're paying attention to are, we had this a little bit in different places in 2024. We're worried this habit is going to increase. Poll workers should be affirmatively offering voters the ID exception form if the voter says, I don't have my ID, right? So they should be saying, oh, do any of these categories, do any of these reasons for not having it apply to you? Great, you can still vote if you can sign this form truthfully, right? What should not be happening, poll workers should not be requiring voters to self-advocate and demand the ID exception form. They should be offering the voter the ID exception form. So if you see, right, that voters are being made to ask for it or just being turned away without being told about it, that's something that's going to cause a red flag for us. We're also going to be looking out for poll workers arguing, right, about whether or not the picture matches the voter. And then having poll workers reject an ID without actually checking the full list, right? So especially if somebody is showing up and they're not using their driver's license or their passport or kind of the routine IDs, but they show up instead with a school ID or they show up with, one of the municipal IDs or a tribal enrollment card. We want to make sure that the poll workers are actually going back to the full state board approved list to check to make sure that the voter is in fact allowed to use it. And so if you see voters being turned away because of photo ID problems and not being given that exception form and not being allowed to use it, then make sure that you flag that to the boiler room, report it out so that we can address it. All right. So let me check some of these questions. We're going to address some of these issues with registration as we keep on going. Yeah, so let's talk about problems with registration. So some of the big problems with registration are the following, right? Sometimes voters who have not voted in the last two general elections, they can be moved to inactive status. This mostly is a problem because it surprises voters that they've been moved to inactive status. They are still allowed to vote. The way you get off inactive status is by voting again. So this should not be a barrier to somebody voting. Other problems, though, are maybe a voter has moved, right, and they didn't update their registration and they need to update their address. A voter claims they were in fact registered, right, but they can't be found in the system, right? Or maybe you just have a poll worker that has a language barrier with the voter and has to work harder to make sure that they are actually searching for the voter by their appropriate name in the system. So all of these are potential issues that people experience with their voter registration. During early voting, right, we want to make sure that the poll workers are telling the voter, you can update your address, right, when you are here during early voting. You can register on site if we just can't find any record of your registration. A lot of those problems with registration can be fixed on site during early voting. In that case, then, yes, the voter will have to provide some sort of proof of address, of residency, if they are making changes to their voter registration file. So in that case, they would want, right, their driver's license address to be current. But voters can also use a bank statement. They can use a utility bill, a lease, a mortgage, any of those kinds of official documents that say, here, this person with this name lives at this address, can be used to satisfy the residency requirement. And that includes digital versions of that. So if somebody is there with a smartphone and they can pull up their bank statement on the app on their phone, they can show that to the poll worker in order to satisfy that documentation requirement. So we want to make sure that during early voting, those options are being made obvious and are being offered to the voters. On election day, right, this gets a little bit more complicated because you can't make changes to your voter file, to your registration information on election day itself. So in that case, we want to make sure that voters are being at least offered the option of using a provisional ballot in case, right, there's some administrative error and it can actually be resolved and sorted out during the post-election canvass period. So that's the period of time where the staff at the county boards of elections are able to review information and fix it potentially on the back end. One point of potential inconsistency on election day, some voters, when they show up at the wrong precinct, are told to go to their old precinct and come back with their authorization to vote form. Some are allowed to cast a provisional ballot at that particular site. There's just a lot of inconsistency. So when you see any of those problems happening, just make sure to report it out. We're trying to get a better sense of what counties are doing when they are presented with this problem. And then, of course, we have the brand new issue with voter registration. That is the zombie claim from the Griffin Riggs lawsuits of last year. So we have still about, I believe, 75,000 voters on the registration repair list. So these are voters whose voter files have been identified as missing their driver's license number and the last four digits of their social security number. And so the state board has said, when these voters show up to vote, either during early voting or on election day, they must use a provisional ballot. And the provisional ballot envelope, which is what that ballot goes into and gets set aside specially to be counted later, will have to be identified as these are the driver's license, social security number people. So that's going to be a new thing to be watching out for. We want to make sure that if you see voters who are being told like, oh, you're on this list, you're going to have to cast a provisional ballot, that it's being explained to them. Many of the voters on this list have been voting, some of them, like many of them, for 20 years. And this will be the first time that they will be told that they are going to have to use a provisional ballot. So a lot of potential room for confusion, for anger, for folks just making mistakes and messing it up. So keep an eye out for this particular issue. Another thing that we are seeing, right, voters who need assistance. So voters are allowed to receive assistance moving through the voting site and filling out their ballot according to their wishes. So if there are voters who have mobility issues, who have, hand tremors, right, and filling out bubbles is like just too difficult for them, if they have literacy or language issues, they are allowed to have somebody assist them in voting according to however they want to vote. So that could be a poll worker. They are also allowed to bring somebody with them. So any voter who has an issue with, who has some sort of issue is allowed to bring any near relative, right? So they can just bring a person to assist them getting through the voting site, right? Filling out their ballot if they need to, and that's fine. If somebody has a disability, they are entitled to bring anybody they want, pretty much. It doesn't have to be a relative. Whatever the circumstances are, the poll workers should be keeping a log of who those inside assistants are. So they're supposed to be recording, right, who those are. And that is just one of the many ways that we already make sure that there's not fraud, right, or exploitation happening at the polls. So this has been a rule for a long time. And so you'll probably, if you see people with assistants, you might see that happening as well. One of the biggest things, right, that we always want to make sure of, and you'll have limited visibility into this from inside, but you can still make sure to check it. If there are people, right, who every single location has curbside voting. So you want to make sure that you do see poll workers kind of going outside and coming back in with ballots to make sure that the folks at curbside voting are being helped. If it looks like that's not happening, you all are allowed to pop outside to check to see if to make sure that the curbside voting is still in fact there and come back in, but make sure that's another thing that voters are entitled to have and should be taken care of. You will also, right, be paying attention to any delays at the voting sites, especially when we have, again, precinct officials and chief judges who are potentially very new to all of this. Lots of common reasons that we experience delays at a polling location. Printers stop working, right? The forms get jammed. Poll workers show up late or they don't have the keys to the building and things open late. Really, we're focusing on internal problems that create backlogs and problems for voters themselves. External delays are not really the kinds of things we report on, right? So we all know that sometimes like there might be traffic jams, there might be an accident outside the polls or something that could make it harder for a voter to get to the location. But we are really only concerned with jams and problems and delays that happen inside. And so the reason that we care about that is because under the law, if there is a delay of more than 15 minutes, the state board can authorize that specific location stay open an equivalent amount of time until, all right, so for voters to get a chance to vote. And so, for example, if we have right a 15-minute delay from at 7:30, then that means that that location might stay open instead till 7:45, which means that the folks who are in line at 7:45 still get to cast a ballot, even if, right, under normal operating hours, technically the voting time is ended. People who arrive in the line, right, and are part of that late cohort, they will most likely be required to cast a provisional ballot that will get separately reviewed and counted after administrative processes. But this is about making sure that the voting site stays open. So anything that causes, right, the line to just stop moving for more than 15 minutes is something that gets reported on immediately. And so let's talk now a little bit about provisional ballots. So lots of reasons why folks might cast a provisional ballot. These are some of the most common ones. Registration record issues, especially on election day. People who are voting, right, they're in the wrong place or they have access to the wrong ballot style. Again, this gets handled inconsistently by counties, but it's one of the main reasons that we see. Then we have folks who, right, are missing their photo ID and need to use a provisional ballot plus the ID exception form. And then we've got folks who are on the registration repair list. So these are the biggest reasons why a voter will be required to use a provisional ballot when they vote. And so when that happens, this is the kind of process we're looking for. So the voter will be taken to a help desk. Either the chief judge or another kind of one of the precinct officials should go there and try to troubleshoot whatever the initial problem is. Two, if they can't resolve it, explain to the voter what is happening. And then that voter will be given not only a provisional ballot, but they'll be given a special ballot envelope. And then that voter should be left alone to actually fill out their ballot. So the precinct worker, the poll worker, should not be hovering around the voter while the voter is actually voting. Once the voter has that provisional ballot, once they have that envelope, the person should walk away, right, to let that voter fill it all out. Then what happens is the voter takes that ballot that they have filled out and they put it into that special envelope. They seal the envelope and they fill out a bunch of information on the front face of the envelope. They take it back to the poll worker. The poll worker will probably then need to write on the ballot on the ballot envelope, on the sealed envelope. The poll worker should be writing nothing on the ballot itself. This is getting written on the envelope, but they'll write down the reason why the internal ballot there was required to be provisional. So there are codes basically that get attached to those envelopes so that the County Board of Elections staff who ends up reviewing them know what it is they're looking for and what they're trying to check and correct. The poll worker should then give the voter it's a provisional ID number. And so they should be given a PIN that voter can then use to look up their provisional ballot in the system in order to see, has it been counted yet? Was it rejected? Is there something I need to do about this? And so we want to make sure that those poll workers are giving the voters that unique number and that they're telling the voter that they are allowed to and track, right, what happens with their ballot once they are done. And then the last kind of thing we're looking for, this is there are rumors that voter challenges might start happening. We haven't really seen this in any sort of organized way. I am not talking about this tonight to prompt conspiracy theories or fear. I'm just letting you all know what voter challenges are in case we start seeing them. So any registered voter or a poll worker can challenge the eligibility of a voter during any day of early voting and on election day. So a registered voter in that county or a person working at the polling site can say, I don't think this person is eligible to vote. I think they moved. I think, right, they're not a US citizen. I think they just don't qualify for whatever reason. That challenge has to be based in evidence. That person will have to sign a document saying they have reason to believe what they are saying is true. And so there is a high standard for these challenges. So if you see a challenge, one, you're going to call the lawyers immediately if you start seeing this happening. But you're also going to make sure, right, that anybody walking in to challenge a voter is being required, right, to sign those forms, to say they have evidence, to produce them that evidence. It is possible that the election officials, that team of 3, that chief judge and those 2 precinct judges, will hold an immediate hearing on site in the voting space about whether or not a person gets to vote. You get to watch that, observe that, and report on it and say what it is they are basing their decisions on. So if you see any of this happening, please call the boiler room right away. Step outside. Wait if you want to like finish hearing what they do with this. Step outside and let us know what's going on. Again, this is incredibly rare. There's just noise happening on the Republican side that this might be a thing they start trying to do. So we want to make sure that we are watching out for it. And so within those specific things, right, obviously those are kind of like our big ones that we anticipate and that we want to watch out for. But you all will have the poll observer FAQs and you will have a poll observer manual that you can also review at your leisure and use to kind of look out for issues. And so questions here. So yes, the assistance issue. So we had this problem. Alamance and Chatham counties were 2 like big offenders on this one. We had poll workers sending married couples to the same voting booth without asking the married couples if they wanted to be voting together. So there is an exception in the law to like the privacy of the ballot. Married couples are allowed to vote together, like not on the same ballot, but allowed to like go to the same booth to vote alongside each other. Poll workers need to ask the couple if they want that. They cannot assume that the married couple should go to the same place and send them there based on the assumption. So if you see that happening, that is something to flag for the chief judge. The reference to that law is going to be in your materials. Yes, it was incredibly frustrating in 2024 when we were seeing this happening a lot, and it was very annoying. With all the substantive issues of law, I know I just went through a lot of stuff in a very kind of high level way. We do have a election law basics information session that is both a live one. The next one is on the 20th, but there's also a recording that our training director posted. So if you kind of want to watch that on your own time to go a little bit more in depth about like kind of the state of the law right now and what we're seeing and what's going on, you can do that. And Debbie, thank you for flagging that. I did not actually close out the provisional ballot process. The provisional ballots are not counted at the polling site. They go into a sealed box and they get taken to the County Board of Elections office. Then they do go through a public counting and review process in the County Board of Elections meetings. So you can watch those meetings to see how the provisional ballots get reviewed, but you will not be watching poll workers open up provisional envelopes and count ballots on site. And if you do see that, let us know because they're not allowed to do that. All right. So now that you kind of know some of what you're looking for and the resources you're going to have to identify problems, let's talk about, right, what you do to solve them. So like I said earlier, right, this is the cast of characters that you're dealing with. The only person that you're really going to be talking to is the chief judge. So if you see poll workers doing something wrong, you are not authorized to try to correct them yourself. You cannot talk to them. So you have to talk to the chief judge, which means you will probably be talking to a Republican. So just know that going in, that's who you're going to be dealing with. Some of them are experienced, right? And some of them I'm sure are going to do a great job. Some of them are also brand new and have never been election workers before, and they're kind of be learning as they go. So we have a big range here for this first election with them. You also cannot talk to voters inside the voting enclosure. So when you see a problem, right, if you have it in your memory that you know what the problem is, great. Otherwise, right, you can check your quick guide, you can report to the database, or you can text or call the boiler room. But if you want to approach the chief judge, right, here is how we recommend doing it. So first, right, we're going to be incredibly respectful. They have pretty much unreviewable authority to kick you out of the voting enclosure if they think you are being disruptive. We can push back on that if they're being unfair. That will take time and is not a guarantee because they have a ton of power, a ton of authority for making sure that the election site and the voting space in particular doesn't get interfered with. So we're going to not be combative with the chief judges, even if we think they're being dinkuses. When we go to them, right, we are rooting our flags with identifying an issue, offering a resource, the proof point for why we think we're right about the issue, the problem we're seeing, and we're going to identify what we are asking them to do about it, right? So for example, right, I noticed that a poll worker rejected a voter student ID from Beaufort County Community College, but the state board has approved that ID, right? Here's the list. I have it. It's published by the State Board of Elections. You can see it right here. Will you, Chief Judge, please remind the poll workers to triple check the list of IDs before they turn voters away and to offer the ID exception form, right? If the voter does not have an approved ID, right? So the materials that you all will have, again, a bit of a difference from what we've done before, we'll have the full-on statute, official published guidance from the state board, regulatory codes, so that you can show them this is the law, right? I'm not making this up. I'm not doing this because like I'm a partisan Democrat. I'm doing this because these are the rules. And so that is kind of the formula that we're using, right? Issue spotting, justification for why you're right, and then asking them for the solution. If you do want to go talk to a voter, you need to follow them outside, right? The times that to do this might be when you know that there's not, right, a bunch of Democrats outside who are greeters or outdoor observers that you can text to flag for them. It might be that you see something really bad happen inside. So a voter who is turned away and they're not allowed to vote at all, right? You can go outside with that voter, introduce yourself and ask them, right? Like, Handcat, I saw that you had a bad experience in there. Would you mind telling me what happened and see if there's anything I can do? They might say no, that's fine. Offer them the voter assistance hotline if they want to call somebody later. But that's pretty much the only way you could talk to a voter. It's if you go outside with them. Otherwise, you will be reporting issues in what's called LBJ. It stands for Lawyers Bound for Justice. And, you know, they decided it was also fun that it was Lyndon B. Johnson. I didn't make it. It has gone through a round of improvements since last fall. We'll see how it works, right? This is why we don't totally count on it, but this is a website. It's formatted for your phone. You're able to kind of use it to report on issues. There's a separate easy 15-minute orientation video we've recorded for it. So that will be sent to you with your materials once we're all done with this. And we'll have office hours and tech hour support so that if you need help with like getting your login and using it, you can do that. So if you're a first-time user of it in particular, don't hesitate to reach out. If LBJ is not working for whatever reason, that's what the boiler room is for. You are able to step outside the voting enclosure to place a call to the boiler room if you need to. You can also text the boiler room and say like, hey, either here's an urgent issue and I need help right now, right? Or somebody needs to send a lawyer to this location right now. Or, you know, LBJ isn't working. I want to flag this. I'm, you know, trying to resolve it and I'll keep you posted. So those are the different kind of methods that you have for resolving those issues. All right, so let me check in on questions so far before we finish. So at the end of voting, yes, so yeah, you don't have access to the count. I did that. Yes, as indoor poll observers, you are allowed to take photos of the voting space before polls open and after they close. So you can take a picture of the kind of the end of the night tabulator count, that ballot count for how many were submitted. That's fine. And correct, Debbie. So you cannot talk to a voter, even if they are a friend of yours, even if you know them. Many precinct locations are very strict about this rule. They do not want you talking to voters at all inside. For the same reason, like you also, and again, this will be in your checklist in your guidebook, you can't wear partisan paraphernalia when you are an indoor poll observer. You truly are there as like you are the shadow on the wall. You are there to just observe, and the only person you're going to talk to is the chief judge, unless you step outside. Lynn, it's not a requirement to take a photo of the tabulator at the beginning and end of the day. Not this cycle, right? During our in 2026, it will be. We'll be keeping closer track of that, but this will be part of the checklist if folks are sticking around that long. All right, and so Chris, so for the municipal elections, the board has said that it is for all nonpartisan municipal elections. So we will see if they clarify that guidance with only when there's a Democrat on the ballot. If so, right, we're just carving out our little maps of all the different municipalities and all the precincts, but that'll go into the scheduling process. All right. Yes, all of them are technically nonpartisan, 100%. But this is the new rule, which was decided a week ago. So again, kudos to all of you guys for being so quick to sign up to do this. All right, so now let's talk about what comes next. All right, so you are going to watch for an email. The email for this one, it's probably going to be sent Friday because I'm still having people site check and copy edit the things that I have written in the past several days. So you're going to get an email with a link to a Google Drive folder that has all the different resources for you, the quick guide, the poll observer manual, the official sort of materials published by the state board, all of that. It'll have the recording of this training in it. It'll have the PowerPoint presentation that was used tonight. And it will also have a link to a scheduling form. So for you all, yeah, Billy, it's early voting too if your county has early voting. Not all counties have early voting for the municipals. So all of that will show up in the scheduling process. So you all will get the link to the scheduling form. You will go through, you'll submit you will include your information, you will select which county you're in, and then you will be taken to a county specific scheduling page. So for some counties, right, they like doing their own internal scheduling. So you might be redirected to a Sign Up Genius or a different person to reach out to for the scheduling purposes. If you are not redirected to a county specific one, you will have the opportunity to tell us your availability on the days for early voting when your county actually has early voting. So again, not all of the counties that have municipal elections have early voting this fall. You'll be sent this form that is going to be sent on Friday will be specific to early voting. The state board has still not confirmed the precinct locations for November 4th, which is just real fun. So there will be a follow-up email that comes for the scheduling of election day poll observing. So just know that there are going to be two forms. If they had given me the date, all of the locations, there would have been one, but unfortunately we are waiting on them to finish their data process. And so one thing I do want to flag for you all, particularly because this is a municipal election, right? Boring days are the norm. Boring days mean that election workers are doing their jobs, that we are not seeing weird shenanigans happen at voting sites, and that the voters who are showing up are being allowed to vote and there aren't being any problems. Boring days are typically more common during the municipal elections because there are fewer voters. But you being present, even if it's for the 6 voters that come through that site on that day, the fact that you are there means that people are going to be acting on their better behavior, right? Because they know they're being watched, they know they're being held accountable. And so your mere presence is an improvement over you not being there. The information that you all are collecting is not only going to make sure that our municipal candidates, right, whose races can be decided with 5 votes, we're making sure that all of their voters' votes get counted. And we're making sure that all the voters who show up during municipal elections are being treated correctly, are being treated fairly, and are getting to cast ballots that will be counted properly, right? You being there also means this is something that we get to do to strategically plan for 2026. So as much as it was kind of a crazy thing to have the state board pivot and change its mind about indoor poll observing for nonpartisan municipal elections. This is honestly a really great opportunity for us to see in real time before we are in 2026 what these brand new precinct judges are doing, what the new interpretations of existing law are going to be, and for us to track, right? Where are problem areas? We already know where some of them are. Are there new ones? And so that is something that is really beneficial and why it is so great to have you all volunteering to do this on kind of crazy and immediate notice. And so thank you all so very, very much for doing this, for signing up. You can email and oops, I lost that slide. I will throw it in the chat. You can email vopro@ncdp.org with any questions about the trainings or follow-up or anything. And so we'll get back to you on that. Look for an email sometime on Friday with the follow-up from this session. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to stop recording, and I will answer any remaining questions that you all have, but you are also free to leave. Thank you all so much for being here. All right.